You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear.
Hey, Shoe and Show listeners, welcome back to another exciting edition of the Shoe and Show, now in its 8th year. I think we started doing podcasting before it was cool. We weren't one of the originals, I know that much, but we were early on, and to be 8 years in and still doing this, I'm shocked. I remember, I've told this story many times, but I remember driving to the studio on the first day we ever taped, and I was like, I have no idea what we're going to talk about. And here we are 8 years later, still yapping and gabbing it up.
And we have 8 years of content too. If people want to go back and listen to older episodes, it's right there in the library.
Yeah, exactly. If you live in your mom's basement, you got nothing better to do to game and to listen to podcasts, you can go to shoeandshow.com and listen to 8 years worth of amazing interviews. And today is no different. In fact, I'm actually very excited about this topic because it's not a sexy topic in the sense it's like, you know, a collab or what's happening in the marketplace or some cool new sneaker drop, but it is critically important when you're sourcing 2.5 billion pairs of shoes every single year is what we do here in the States. This topic, supply chain visibility, forced labor, tools to navigate and to track it, all that is super critically important. And we have a partner in LRQA who we've been partners with since I started my job here over 15 years ago. So we've long been with InFact and turned to Elevate, which is now LRQA. And we have JP Stevenson on today, who's head of market development EIQ at LRQA. And JP, I want to bring you in on this conversation because you're the expert, we're the lay people in a sense, and want to welcome you to Shoe and Show, and then just kind of give us an idea of like what on earth is a head of market development, what is EIQ, and kind of what's your position at LRQA?
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Matt Thomas, for having me today. Real excited about this conversation, though. It is heavy. First, EIQ. So, LRQA is a very large assessment body. You know, for about the past 20 years, we have been doing social environmental auditing. And for about the past 10 years, so a little bit before when you started your podcast, we thought it might be a smart idea to start digitalizing actually what we were finding when we would send trained assessors into factories. And so, now what we have is what I think to be the industry's most robust data set on ESG issues. And so our tool, EIQ, helps a lot of footwear, apparel brands have better visibility into where risks are. And we'll get into this in the conversation today. I'd highlight with this as well, especially for issues like forced labor. There's not a silver bullet. EIQ is not a silver bullet. But what we do see are a lot of issues as they present themselves, and we think that this helps at least brands begin to ask the right questions when they start looking at issues like forced labor more rigorously.
Talking about these common issues you see and looking at the data, what are you seeing when it comes to footwear?
Yeah. So, in the context of forced labor in particular, we see labor issues generally be really, really prevalent. So, as context, we focus a lot on this industry. It makes up a huge chunk of our data set. About 60% of the audits that we undertake for the apparel and footwear textile industries have some type of major labor-related problem that's found on site. This is either related to working hours or the number of days that workers are continuously employed. And for footwear in particular, if we just look at like excessive overtime, about a third of all audits that we undertake reflect some type of major problem with this. And I think this is important context for the conversation today because forced labor is a really complicated issue to address. But what we do know is that when you have labor issues within the factory, it's oftentimes indicative of much broader problems, which can be suggestive of the place you would start when you begin evaluating for forced labor.
Yeah, so let's level set a little bit, JP, because the industry has had a long history of, and when I say industry, I mean kind of the West, right? Global brands are housed or headquartered in North America or the European marketplace. But we've had a long history of having poured in tons of resources into improving the lives of our workforce, no matter where we find them, whether they're our own workers or they're workers making our product with contract manufacturers. And as is the case, there's a clash of cultures, right, that happens. And I would argue that, and I think others at LRQA, Ian Spalding's a dear friend of mine, we've had this conversation many times, but I would argue that a lot of even the local labor laws that you find in production countries are there because of the influence and guidance and lobbying, if you will, of Western brands. And so
completely.
So as you talk about challenges, there's going to be challenges found, and I want to unpack this more. I'm not trying to whitewash that by any stretch. But at the same time, it's also this acknowledgement for our listeners that if it wasn't for companies working with the LRQAs of the world, many of these places wouldn't know what a strong labor law looked like, wouldn't have the standards that we're talking about. So we've really created this industry that helps kind of guide us through the process of working with contract manufacturers and then having a point of view on how their workers should be treated. Is that a good assessment?
Absolutely. So the relationship between the brand and the supplier has been pivotal in elevating the standards of the industry historically, and I think we'd be in a much worse position for it. And I guess my guidance also with how we go deep with forced labor builds upon that, because I think we've made good headway in establishing leverage with these sites. There is a critical dependency on the brand in particular out of the U.S. for economic development, but there's still quite a bit more that needs to happen to strengthen that relationship. First, so that you're getting accurate information around the supply chain, and second, so you're able to go deeper. Because one of the things that we know as well is, I think we've put ourselves in a position where now we have visibility into these issues for your tier one. I mean, the fact that we have data on labor-related problems in factories suggests that what we've done has worked to some extent. But we also know that it's your tier two plus where oftentimes the worst issues sit.
One of the things, as we're tracking this issue, the Department of Homeland Security puts out statistics on enforcement related to forced labor, but it lumps apparel, footwear, and textile together. So from us, at times it's a challenge to kind of see the scope of the problem because it's all kind of grouped together. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, are there some big differences in footwear and apparel from what you're seeing from factory audit standpoint, other issues? What's your view on kind of the challenges with apparel versus footwear? What makes our industry unique from your perspective?
Yeah, there's tends to be some broader problems, I say, around health and safety that you don't generally see to the same extent with apparel manufacturers, but you do see this common core of issues where footwear sits right alongside apparel and having really difficult labor-related problems, in part because you're also largely dependent upon some of the same very vulnerable demographics that are used in production. I'd say outside of that too, you're also subject to some of the same problems that complicate disclosure and monitoring. So outside of just the high prevalence of general labor related issues, one of the things that holds true for footwear and apparel is that what visibility we actually have through audits is really complicated by the integrity of disclosures from factories. So
Yeah.
as an example, we run within our audit process an assessment of the transparency of site disclosures. This basically is an evaluation of, when the auditor goes in, do the books make sense? Is there something that's suspect that comes up in conversations with workers in the factories? And obscuring the visibility that we do have, we find in China, as an example, about half of all audits are transparent. So that means that half aren't. You're sending someone in, you're spending millions of dollars on expensive responsible sourcing programs, but they're actually not able to generate forms of disclosure that you can use for management. And I think that, especially in the context of, again, hunting for the fire where there's smoke, really complicates our ability to then identify symptoms of forced labor and then go deeper to actually figure out what we can do to address it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a unique, I use this example all the time. It's a very unique proposition, JP, because it's essentially, as you walk into, I don't know, a Starbucks in the States or Chipotle or McDonald's, and you say, before I place an order with you as a customer, I'd like to see your time cards and your HR documents. And that's ridiculous, right? But that's exactly what we do as an industry with these contract manufacturers. And so it's this weird, awkward dance that our consumers and our society have an expectation that we'll source responsibly, but the nuts and bolts of that are a little awkward, and they have been for decades. This isn't new, right? None of this stuff we're talking about is new. But I will say what's new, I think, from your perspective and from ours is, 5 or 10 years ago, there'd be like a U.S. Department of Labor report on forced labor, and it would come out every few years. And it would basically be a collection and summary of blogs that are out there from NGOs. And footwear was always on the list. It was in like a ton of different countries. And there was kind of a collective yawn around the release, right?
Yeah.
But now we've codified this Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and the establishment of this interagency process in the federal government here in the U.S. that has a lot of power to seize shipments, to stop shipments from coming in, to have withhold release orders placed on products. And there's a lot more oomph, if you will, in the law than what there used to be. But it seems as if a lot of the reporting still is like relying on NGOs and blogs and stuff. So for our members, it's a real challenge because they want to do what's right. They want to do what's right by the law in the U.S. They want to do what's right by the law in the local production country. What are strategies that companies can kind of real, like tangible strategies companies can adopt in partnership with LRQA or others that kind of cuts through the fluff, cuts through the NGO kind of aspect of it, the narrative, and really gets to the core issue so that they can be responsive to the law, but also still work with companies that are making great product for consumers all over the world?
Yeah, definitely. Great question. So we have seen the mechanisms for assessing risk not be held to a very high standard historically. Like civil society disclosures, I think have been great in bringing awareness to issues. But if you have been relying on those alone to figure out where you go deep in your supply chain, or even some of the less stringent audit standards, you're probably not getting the visibility that is now required by the UFLPA or the EU forced labor ban. I think first you got to really own your data. It seems really cumbersome and it's a little bit unsexy as a practical recommendation. But I do think that now that we're in an era of what we're calling Assurance 4.0, where it's really not just about the standards of your own operations that you're held to, it's the standards of your supply chain. Say, for example, if you are flagged by the CBP in relationship to, having a entity that is connected to UFLPA, if you don't own your data and have visibility to go deeper into your supply chain, you have no defense against it. You can't file an appeal. Conversely, we've also seen, for this industry, cases where entities have been wrongfully named by civil society as being associated with entities that are connected to forced labor, and if they've really owned their data, had a clear understanding of chain of custody, or at least who makes up most of their supply chain activities, they've been able to push back and in many cases have those statements retracted. So I'd say as a starting point, there's that. Now, honestly, that's like a 10-year process for a lot of brands to go beyond your tier one to your tier two to your tier three. That's led a lot of folks to look at traceability solutions as a mechanism for that. We've actually had for the past few years a partnership with the U.S. Department of Labor to look at these solutions, and I don't think any of them are a magic bullet. There's trade-offs associated with each, but they can all help you better own your data. So, like, some folks have looked at, for example, like standard off-the-shelf traceability solutions that would look at the set of activities that make up your supply chain. I think the question there is, are they fit for purpose? A lot of these are engineered to show the chain of administrative activities that you have, but they won't necessarily provide you with an understanding of the risk associated with it. So great for building your data set and actually understanding who you're potentially connected with, but you probably need something else around it. A lot of folks have looked at like mapping and visualization tools for it. I think when we think of like traceability, that's often the image that comes to mind. I think the challenge with that is, the underlying data sets are oftentimes quite weak around that. And especially when you're going upstream in your supply chain, and if you don't own the data, you're not going to be in a position where that network really reflects anything that's uniquely insightful. It also changes all the time. Similarly, we've seen folks rely on self-assessment questionnaires that are sent out to their suppliers, and Scout's honor they're going to disclose accurately. Great for getting a list of names, but again, I think we can see the limitations when it comes to actually finding risk. What will you find as a good stopgap measure is monitoring solutions. So, as an example, one type of data that we look at outside of just audit data is we have a tool called Sentinel that every month scans, I think at this point, about 350,000 factories every month. And what it looks for there is really, really localized disclosures in Chinese, for example, that would, based upon, say, an IPO report or some type of public filing that, your brand team in the US probably can't read, but our analyst team sitting near the factory in China can, that would list out entities that are connected materially to your supply chain, and that can form the basis of at least understanding whether or not there's a connection there that you're comfortable with. The last set of solutions that we see some folks relying on are DNA-based tools. The CBP has stated that is generally a preferred approach. Even that, though, we know they have major limitations with it. For example, within the apparel industry, you really we've heard often that you can't test anything that's not pure strands of cotton. So any of your blends, actually, they won't really work for. So In so much as, again, none of these systems work independently sufficiently to address the challenge. If you're looking at how you do build out your data set, you need to have a toolkit for it, and it has to be fit for purpose for the challenge at hand.
It's really interesting because you also have to prove the negative with the UFLPA law. I mean, you're being asked to say, the CBP will come in and or DHS and say, show us that there is no forced labor in your entire supply chain, mapping the whole thing. And you're saying that there are, you mentioned, the DNA testing. It sounds like it's not completely adequate, and I'm just wondering, you talked about trade-offs too of kind of this multiple approach too. Can you talk a little more about that? And I mean, how do you manage that with proving the negative that there's no forced labor if in fact there's huge shortfalls in some of these tools?
Yeah, definitely. So we've worked on a bunch of appeals, and it has been a really complicated process of building out, a giant case of documentation that's submitted around it, and we're pretty good. It often goes through, but it doesn't all the time go through. But it's laborious if you have not put together the system originally, because you are looking at, again, how do you establish something that looks similar to chain of custody over your orders based upon the documents that you have in hand, which is part of the reason why I also think, again, returning to the first point around traceability systems and building out your understanding of entities that you're related to, that's really key, and the long-term fix. I guess where we see companies do this best is when they take it as a broader strategic initiative to look at how they can actually build more leverage over their suppliers in a positive way, so that they might put them in a position where they're comfortable to disclose more. And so a couple of really good examples, I think of that. First, we look at some really innovative examples within apparel and footwear in like Puma, for example. Puma, I think, generally has done an excellent job of owning their data. A part of that has been building out a supply chain finance program that would actually, for better disclosures and improvement on your operations, reward you with better lending terms there. And so it's just not all stick. There's also carrot with it as well, too. And, the program's it's not new. They've had it in place for 5 years. I'm surprised we haven't seen more folks adopt it, because it seems like it's been a really pretty dang effective way of creating an incentive to work more collaboratively with your suppliers. I think the other thing around this too is we got to change the way that we look at disclosure a little bit as well. So one of the points that you made initially, Matt, was that at this point in time we've invested millions and millions of dollars in building out responsible sourcing programs that have gone and elevated the standards of the industry. In areas where there's not necessarily strong legal frameworks. I think one of the areas that we still struggle with, and it is around why so few cases of forced labor or the really big zero tolerance issues are disclosed. I mean, if you have these functions, actually, we should be finding more instances of this. We know that 50 million people are in some form of modern slavery today. It's just, again, the mechanisms that we have in place probably aren't appropriate for that. And I think part of it comes down to when cases are found, it becomes very taboo, and actually your supply chain is condemned for it. But I do see examples where companies have taken this on in a really big way, gotten really serious about it, and they've made progress. The one that I like to talk about, not from your industry, but from food. So Tony's Chocolonely, they focus just on modern slavery. And one of the things that they found is when they went really deep within their suppliers, they were actually finding, I think, as much as 2,000 instances of child labor. And they're a tiny brand. I mean, they're like 0.05% of global market share for chocolate. But when you're that tiny, going that deep, and you find that much, I mean, I think it exposes some obvious problems that you have within much bigger, better funded, responsible sourcing programs from, major chocolate suppliers. And I think as an analogy, that also holds true for, the majors of our industry too. You just have to figure out what the mechanisms are, be it looking at your contractual relationships with suppliers differently, looking at how you treat these instances when they come up as, being problematic, but something that you work through with them in such a way that they're actually surfaced rather than something that remains kind of invisible. And that I think is like really at the core of the challenge around forced labor today.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. I mean, it's kind of a mix of data and line of sight and enforcement and almost law enforcement and almost like intelligence gathering. And it's a lot to put on a guy who's sourcing sneakers, right? It's just it's a really complex relationship. Yeah. And as you were just kind of talking about these instances, I mean, it is human nature for when money is involved for companies to hide things that would be deemed zero tolerance. And so it's a struggle for a brand. I mean, we have a code of conduct we developed with LRQA, 12, 13, 14 years ago. And forced labor was zero tolerance. But the moment you put something zero tolerance and it doesn't go down kind of the corrective action plan channel, right? Meaning we found that you're violating certain aspects of labor law or working hours or wages, and we're not going to kill the contract. We're going to work with you to develop a plan to improve. The moment you kind of box that off and you say, you know what, we're going to tear up the contract, we find forced labor or child labor, there's going to be incentive for people to want to, protect money, right? That's kind of human nature, as sinful as we are. So it's like that to me is so complex, and to put all that on a guy who's sourcing for sneakers, it just is a challenge. But last question, JP, before we let you go, 5 years from now, let's fast forward to pushing up against 2030. Where is the industry going to be in the evolution of information gathering, supply chain visibility, and forced labor?
Yeah. So folks are in the data gathering phase now, and I think you can't stop that train. And as soon as folks have better supply chain visibility, it also becomes pretty obvious who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. I think that we will probably be in a position where it doesn't matter if it's forced labor or environmental disclosures around your supply chain. It's easy to get an understanding of actually if someone's program is working in the way that it's supposed to, and if otherwise not, someone is greenwashing. I also do think that we're going to see an evolution of the legal treatment of this to be closer towards that case that we just talked about, where disclosure is viewed differently. I'm actually going to Australia next week to talk to some folks about modern slavery because they are having this discussion in the context of their law. You know, they've had modern slavery laws for a number of years. They found that actually they're not fit for purpose just because actually they aren't finding cases of forced labor that exist and do exist within Australia. And so I think in some ways that heralds where, the legal evolution of this will be. The other thing that's good, though, about this as well is I think we are also now in a period where industry is beginning to see that this problem is too big to be worked along singularly. And so, especially on the back end of the supply chain, we'll probably see many great footwear brands work together on these issues, which will make the heavy lifting of both managing the risk around it and handling subjects like disclosure much easier because there will be a common set of standards.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Well, JP, I could talk to you, as unsexy as all this is, as we talked about at the start, I could talk to you all day about it. But to our listeners, if you want to learn more, you can hit up JP's on LinkedIn. You can go to LRQA.com to learn even more. You can shoot us a note at info@fdra.org. We'll be happy to put you in contact with JP and the entire LRQA team. So, JP, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Matt and Thomas. Thanks a ton.
So, Thomas, the last thing I'll say before we close out is that if we can't solve the supply chain visibility problem just yet, my hope is that we can convince U.S. Customs and Border Protection to stop calling the UFLPA UFOPA, which is like their thing. It sounds like it's straight out of Willy Wonka, and I will never refer to it as UFOPA. I mean, are you with me, Thomas? I don't know if you're with me on this one.
Yeah, it's a little awkward. I mean, I guess Congress should have thought of that, though, when they were naming the bill. Like, you're gonna try to pronounce it, the acronym. So yeah, they call it UFOPA. I always say UFLPA because I'm like you. I feel weird saying UFOPA. It just doesn't roll off the tongue. I mean, people call us Fedra sometime, which I think is was a drug that pitchers used in baseball a long time ago. Maybe that was ephedrine. But anyway, I digress. Folks, thanks for listening to shoeandshow.com. What is not awkward is going to shoeandshow.com, downloading all of our episodes, subscribe, share it with your friends, rate us. We have an algorithm, much like LRQA, I assume has a bunch of algorithms. We have an algorithm and only allows you to rate us at 5 stars. If you try 4.5, 4.8, you get kicked out. That's just the way it is. But rate us, share us, and until next time, Shoe and Show is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.